The Nile River makes life possible in the otherwise barren desert of Egypt. Although the river flows from the highlands of Central Africa, the ancient Egyptians believed that it was created by the sun god. As one pharaoh, Amenhotep IV, said, "You made the Nile in the underworld, you bring it when you wish to nourish the people." The Nile is the longest river in the world, extending over 4,000 miles from its source in Lake Victoria in Central Africa to its mouth at the Mediterranean Sea. It is one of the few rivers of the world to flow from south to north. Thus, the ancient Egyptians could catch the current to travel northward. To travel southward, they used sails to catch the prevailing northerly wind. Navigation has always been difficult on the southern reaches of the Nile, with its stretches of rapids, falls, and swamps. But after the Nile enters Egypt proper, at Aswan, Elephantine in antiquity, the river flows unhampered for some 600 miles to the Mediterranean. North of Cairo, it slows and fans out into several channels, creating a delta, the typical triangular shape of a river's mouth. Egyptians thought of their country as two separate areas based on the river, Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. Upper Egypt extended from Elephantine northward to Memphis. Lower Egypt was the delta area. Some of the common motifs of ancient Egypt symbolized this division. For example, the combined lotus and papyrus decoration, the lotus for Upper Egypt and papyrus for Lower Egypt. Throughout Egypt's history until the Aswan Dam was built in 1964, the annual flooding of the Nile gave life to the country. Every year, the monsoon rains in Ethiopia fed into the river, and by June, the river began to rise in Egypt. In July and August, it continued rising and became more reddish in color from silt. Cresting in mid-September, the waters receded in October and November, leaving layers of nutrient-bearing silt on the floodplain. Then farmers could plant and harvest their crops before the next flood season. Gardens, which had to be watered throughout the year, were irrigated principally from canals from which water was raised by means of a shaduf. The meaning of the Nile's flood for Egypt was noted by Shakespeare in Antony and Cleopatra when he wrote, "The higher Nilus swells, the more it promises. As it ebbs, the seedsman upon the slime and ooze scatters his grain, and shortly comes to harvest." The flood area in Egypt was a thin strip on either bank of the river. At the edge of this fertile strip, the desert abruptly begins and extends for miles to the east and the west. The Nile Valley, if looked at in cross-section, has four main parts: the Nile River itself, the green floodplain with farming and settlements, the low desert of varying width, elevated a bit above the floodplain, and the high desert above an escarpment at the edge of the low desert. The completion of the Aswan High Dam, which halted the flooding, was a mixed blessing. Hydroelectric power is being generated, and year-round irrigation in some regions permits more harvests. But valuable silt no longer reaches the lower Nile. The delta is threatened by erosion, and soil salinity is increasing. Besides being essential to ancient Egypt for food and transportation, the Nile influenced its technology. In order to prepare for the flood, Egyptians wanted to be able to predict the height of the crest. So they invented nilometers to gauge the rate of rising waters against the previous year's record. In addition, the flood was known to begin 70 days after the disappearance from the sky of the star Sirius. Thus, the Egyptians' use of astronomy and their star observations played an important role in flood prediction. In a sense, then, it was the Nile that helped to create mathematics and science in ancient Egypt. The great importance of the Nile to the ancient Egyptians is shown in the sacred oath they all took when they stood before Osiris and the judges of the dead. "I have not sullied the water of the Nile. I have not stopped its flow in the good time. I have dammed up no canal." Indeed, throughout its history, the Nile has continued to nourish Egypt.
The architecture of ancient Egyptian temples and the rituals performed within them reflected the well-ordered ideals of the society. The temple, as an institution, was at the heart of Egyptian culture. There was no separation of religion and state in ancient Egypt. The king was the high priest of Egypt and was himself in some ways divine. He played a crucial role in some religious ceremonies. Ceremonies in the temples were conducted by priests who always represented the king and were attended by a few people who were privileged to enter the sacred place. Daily rituals were enacted by the priests on behalf of the deity or deceased person, to whose spirit the temple was dedicated. Temples were centers of literacy. They served as repositories for archives of detailed records of temple activities. They also had schools for the education of priests, scribes, and craftsmen. Lands were donated to temples by the king or by pious individuals. These estates generated income for the support of the temple and the priests. By controlling cultivable land, temples played an important role in the agricultural economy of Egypt. Priests lived in the temple complex. They were expected to adhere to a standard of priestly behavior, which included wearing garments made only of linen and papyrus sandals, washing 4 times a day, and shaving their bodies every other day. The size and decoration of temples indicated the wealth and importance of the deity and of the nearby town. Important temples consisted of a complex of courts, halls, and rooms surrounded by an enclosure wall. Inside this wall, a front court was entered through an imposing pylon, a thin, high double tower decorated on the outside by scenes of the king vanquishing the enemies of Egypt. Pylons represented the eastern and western mountains, between which the life-giving sun traveled each day. Their shape is similar to that of the hieroglyph for horizon. Interior halls were brightly painted. Their high ceilings, which represented the sky, were supported by massive columns, whose decoration recreated the primordial marshes, full of papyrus and lotus plants. The temple was a physical metaphor for the world and its creation. On a pedestal, in an elevated, darkened sanctuary at the rear of every temple, was a shrine containing the image of the divinity and a sacred boat. The sanctuary represented the spot where the creation of the world took place, the primeval mound where the Creator separated light from darkness, good from evil, earth from heaven, and river from desert, and gave life to gods, people, and other beings. There were many kinds of temples, similar in form but with different functions. Cult temples, such as Karnak, Luxor, Edfu, and Memphis, were dedicated to a major god. These gods were responsible for the annual flood of the river Nile and the resulting crops and harvest. The result of agricultural abundance was the ability to build magnificent temples, which in turn ensured that the gods would bestow continued prosperity. Temples attached to pyramid tomb complexes sustained and kept alive the spirit and memory of the deceased king and queen. These temples evolved into the New Kingdom mortuary temples, built at Thebes and on the West Bank, like Deir el-Bahri, Medinat Habu, and the Ramesseum. Rock-cut temples were built at locations that had sacred significance, like the sacred peak of western Thebes, the sandstone quarries at Jebel Silsila, and the spectacular site of the Temple of Abu Simbel in Nubia. While lay people were not ordinarily permitted within the temple, the populace did become involved with the temple activities during many religious festivals. The greatest of the ancient Egyptian religious festivals were the Opet festival, which guaranteed the fertility of the land and a bountiful harvest, the Festival of the Valley at Western Thebes, which honored the dead ancestors and mortuary deities, and the Sed festival, which celebrated the regeneration of the divine king. During these festivals, the sacred image of the deity in its shrine was carried or traveled by boat in procession through towns and villages. At such times, any believer could behold the shrine and have a personal experience with his deity. The temple was the cornerstone of Egyptian society. It reminded Egyptians of the nature of their world and their role in the divine kingdom. The beauty and majesty of the ruins of those temples that have survived testify to the religious and creative inspiration of their builders. Egyptian art represented the world in a stylized and often symbolic way, rather than with detailed realism based on perspective and foreshortening. The art of pharaonic Egypt evolved rapidly after 3000 BC, following 1500 years of slow development in the prehistoric period. Throughout Egyptian history, there was a strong functional relationship between sculpture, painting, and the architectural environments, of which representational art was an integral part. The ancient Egyptians produced art in many forms, from paintings and sculpture to decorative and functional art to magnificent architecture. Types of sculpture included monumental stone statues, smaller sculptures in a variety of materials, and wall reliefs. The Egyptians excelled in minor arts, such as ceramics, jewelry, and furniture design. They fashioned exquisite metalwork. Egyptian art and architecture used elements derived from the Egyptian environment of river, marsh, and desert. The art reflected harmony between human society and the divine natural environment. This harmony was symbolized by the goddess of order, Maat, daughter of the creator's sun god, Re. Human figures in Egyptian art were laid out according to a strict canon of proportions, a standard grid on which the figure was traditionally 18 squares high. This grid system facilitated enlarging and reducing from model designs to full-scale pieces. The Egyptian rendering of the human form combined profile and front views in the same figure. The head was shown in profile with the eye seen from the front. The shoulders faced front, while the breast, waist, and legs were in profile. Art was life-sustaining for the spirit of the god or the dead person who was represented. This vital quality was provided by the final application of painted colors and the hieroglyphic inscriptions to the work. The inscriptions were thought to make the art functional, specifically for the named individuals. Scenes of important activities, sculpted in relief, usually accompany hieroglyphic inscriptions. The reliefs portray the subject of the hieroglyphs, and together with the hieroglyphs, define the subject being portrayed. The hieroglyphs may identify individuals, quote spoken words, or describe activities in the relief. The revolutionary reign of the New Kingdom pharaoh, Amenhotep IV, also known as Akhenaten, between 1352 and 1336 BC, produced some of the most extraordinary developments in Egyptian art since the early Old Kingdom. The startling naturalism of this period is exemplified by works found in an artist's studio at Amarna, such as the bust of Queen Nefertiti and the life masks of the members of the royal family. Although the technology of ancient artisans was relatively limited, the quality of the workmanship was often very good, showing a highly evolved sense of order, careful attention to detail, and deep knowledge of the materials. The Egyptians did most of their work with very simple tools and techniques. Stone, even hard stones like granite and basalt, were cut with tools made of copper and later of bronze. Other tools, such as hammers, were made of dolerite, a very hard stone. Sand was used as an abrasive to grind and finish stonework. Painting techniques are perhaps the least well understood of Egyptian artistic conventions. We know that the Egyptians preferred to use outlined flat areas of color. Their rather limited palette was based on the colors red ochre, yellow ochre, copper blue, and malachite green, as well as lampblack and gypsum, or lead white. We have examples of Egyptian painting that must have required very fine brushes, cut from reeds and masterfully employed. In antiquity, most surfaces of buildings, sculptures, and small objects were brightly painted. Hard stone statues, of which there were many, were probably painted only in selected areas. From as early as the Old Kingdom, around 2500 BC, the Egyptians employed a range of colors and a wonderful variety of painting techniques that is not always visible to us in the deteriorated examples of their art that survive today.
Today, we are awed by the remains of at least 92 pyramids in Egypt. Kings of Dynasty IV built the largest of these royal tombs. The pyramid's four-sided triangular shape was an important symbol for the Old Kingdom Egyptians. It evoked the essential life-giving powers of the creator god Re. Re became the most important god for the kings of Dynasty 4 and 5, and each considered himself to be the son of Re. Pyramids may be enlargements of a pyramid-shaped stone that was the central object of worship at Re's great temple at Heliopolis. This stone marked the spot where the first mound of land appeared from the waters of chaos at the time of creation. Re, the creator god, stood atop this mound and made a god and goddess, thus starting the creation process. The size of a king's pyramid often indicated how prosperous and powerful he was. Pharaoh Khufu, whom the Greeks called Cheops, built the largest pyramid, one of 3 Dynasty IV pyramids at Giza. Rising almost 500 feet into the air, the sides of the pyramid were more than 750 feet wide at the base. The pyramid consisted of about 2,300,000 blocks of stone, the largest of which weighed 20 tons. Each of these stones had to be quarried, transported, and assembled. No wonder it is one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. The Great Pyramid of Pharaoh Khufu is a testament to the incredible administrative and engineering skills of the Egyptians. Since papyrus and writing had been developed, Khufu's architects were able to plan the construction of this large project in advance. They also had good local sources of stone and, most importantly, a large body of laborers who could be drafted into service. The result was a highly sophisticated, yet visually simple structure. Workforces estimated at not more than 10,000 men at one time built the pyramids. That's a relatively small number for such a huge monument. The laborers, who were not slaves, were available during the annual summer flood season when they couldn't farm the land. Traces of what were probably the workers' quarters and workshops have survived at Giza. The kings of Egypt usually built their pyramids in the western desert because they associated the west with the afterlife. Most entrances to the pyramids faced north. The Egyptians figured out what direction was north by marking on a wall the rising and setting points of a circumpolar star, and then bisecting the marks. When the king was to be buried under the pyramid, the first construction was to cut a passageway at the burial chamber in the bedrock. Then the first course of either local limestone blocks or mud brick and rubble was laid down in a square. Each of the following courses was smaller than the one below it, until there was room for only a capstone at the top. Finally, an outside casing of fine limestone, transported to the site by canal, was put in place. All this was done without mortar. When the casing was smooth from top to bottom, the pyramid was finished. The king had his resting place, where his body would be protected and his spirit housed for all eternity. Each pyramid was merely the central element of a large complex that included a funerary temple, generally located against the east face of the pyramid. This temple was connected to a valley temple at the eastern edge of the complex by a long descending causeway. Often there were smaller pyramids for the king's queens and tombs belonging to his noblemen. We know much about the pyramids, but many unanswered questions remain. Egyptologists from Egypt and elsewhere are busy excavating pyramid sites and studying the archaeological remains to prove existing theories and to formulate new ones. Although we may never have all the answers, these magnificent edifices are formidable reminders of the fascinating culture of ancient Egypt.
The nuclear family was the fundamental unit of ancient Egyptian society. The father was responsible for the economic well-being of the family, while the mother supervised the household and cared for the children, who in return owed their parents strict obedience. Sons usually married at 20 or older, and daughters at a somewhat younger age. Many marriages were arranged by parents, but much Egyptian love poetry reflects genuine passion and affection. To marry, a couple simply made a contract and one moved in with the other. Divorce was permitted and could be initiated by husband or wife. The primary purpose of marriage was to continue the family line through children. Although children had toys and are depicted at play, much of their time was spent preparing to be adults. Girls learned how to run a household. Male offspring often apprenticed with their fathers. Peasant children went to the fields with their parents, while more privileged children received formal education, leading, it was hoped, to a career as a scribe. Children's final responsibility to their parents was to bury them according to strict religious practice. People usually died before reaching 50. Clothing children in ancient Egypt was easy because they usually were naked, as farmers in the field often were. Adults often wore linen clothing and sometimes wool when it was cool. Although styles changed over ancient Egypt's long history, garments were usually white and sometimes pleated. All usually went barefoot. The Egyptians' multicolored jewelry was displayed well against their white clothing. The finest examples were of gold and silver with inlays of semi-precious stones. The most common jewelry was the necklace, but they also wore armlets, wristlets, anklets, and rings. Earrings were a relatively late addition. The wealthy, both men and women, sometimes wore elaborate wigs. Although men sometimes had a thin mustache or a neat beard, they generally were clean-shaven. The ancient Egyptians used scented oil and ointments to protect their skin and hair from the hot climate. They also used green and black eye makeup that they stored in small containers called kohl pots. The Egyptians built their houses of sun-dried mud bricks. Some enjoyed amenities such as latrines and shower baths, but had no running water and poor drainage. Their light came only from oil lamps and the sun. Because of limited space, urban houses in towns along the Nile were close together and had several floors. Tomb paintings give us a good idea of noblemen's residences in Thebes during the New Kingdom. The main floor held the public areas, while the private sleeping quarters were on the upper floors and the roof. Servants lived and worked in the basement. Rural houses of noblemen were usually far more expansive, often with elegant gardens and surrounded by a wall. Usually one story, these houses had spacious public quarters with pillars and a high ceiling. Servants lived in separate buildings within the compound. The working class had far more modest houses, as can be seen in the excavations at Deir el-Medina, a workers' village of about 70 houses. These long, narrow houses had many of the same features as upper-class houses, only on a much smaller scale. Most homes were equipped with a cylindrical baked clay stove that burned wood, charcoal, or dried manure. Cooking, storage, and eating vessels were pottery. The Egyptians consumed meat, fowl, and fish, and grew vegetables such as beets, onions, turnips, lettuce, beans, and peas. Their fruits included grapes, dates, and watermelon, and breads abounded. The wealthy delighted in wine, and they were all great beer drinkers. The Egyptians were a fun-loving people. The aristocracy had formal banquets, often featuring an orchestra. They all enjoyed music, often made with flutes, clappers, or sistra, a kind of rattle. Men and boys hunted wild animals, fowl, and fish with bows and arrows, throw sticks, and lassos. They often hunted with dogs, but also kept dogs as pets. Cats weren't domesticated until around 2025 BC. Monkeys were luxury pets for the wealthy. At home, families enjoyed board games. People of modest social rank could worship at small local temples, and they also practiced their own version of folk religion at home and at work. A survey of the archaeological evidence gives us the impression that the Egyptians loved life and were willing to overlook its hardships. Indeed, they believed the perfect afterlife was simply an idealized version of their earthly existence.
Water transport on the Nile River was important in Egypt from the earliest times. With their boats, the Egyptians exploited the river in many ways. Our knowledge of ancient Egyptian boats comes from tomb paintings and reliefs, from boat models, and from a few actual boats recovered from burial sites. Unlike most rivers of the world, the Nile flows from south to north, easily allowing boats to travel downstream. Fortunately, the prevailing wind is from north to south, so a boat can travel upstream under sail. From pre-dynastic times, Egyptians fished and hunted from small boats for ducks, geese, and other animals in marshes along the banks of the Nile. The earliest small craft were rafts made of papyrus, a reed that grew in abundance along the shores of the Nile. Bundles of papyrus were tied together at one end to form a spoon-like shape with an upturned prow. These rafts could be propelled with punting poles or paddled with hands or oars. Small boats were also used to ferry people across the river or to travel short distances up or downstream. Small boats were made of wood as well as papyrus, but local wood was of poor quality. The boat builder had to use fairly short planks, which were secured to each other with a mortise and tenon joint, a method of connecting planks. The Egyptians also had large riverboats, which served secular and religious purposes. These boats were without keels and made from long planks of wood imported from outside Egypt. They also had a spoon-like shape with an upturned prow and stern, often decorated with animal or flower motifs. The steering gear was a large oar on the stern used as a rudder. Boats for commerce in Egypt required sails and varying numbers of oarsmen. Barges used to carry building stones and other heavy loads were towed by small boats which were rowed by oarsmen. During flood periods, stone, for the pyramids at Giza, for example, could be brought on barges right up to the building site. Commerce depended on a well-developed river transport system to move cargo between regions of the country. Sea travel was also undertaken to the Palestinian coast and along the Red Sea for trade in the products of Egypt, gold, papyrus, linen, and ceramics, in exchange for those of Asia, timber, dyes, perfumes, incense, ivory, and crafts. Seagoing boats required some kind of keel and were of sturdier construction than riverboats. Large rivercraft were used for traveling as well as for commerce. Royal persons and government functionaries, as well as other important people who had reasons to visit different parts of the country, often traveled on the river. The pharaohs traveled in palatial barges. Large boats were important in the Egyptian military. The most famous example of the military use of boats is the battle against the so-called Sea Peoples. This great naval victory of Ramses III is depicted on the walls of one of his temples. Men are shown on board fighting with spears, clubs, and bows and arrows, and throwing enemies into the river. Since boats were so important in Egyptian daily life, it is no surprise that they also figured prominently in religious life. On certain festival days, god statues in sacred boats or barks were taken from their temples and carried through the streets by priests. Funerary practices also involved boats, both as transportation and as part of the burial equipment. Carvings and paintings of boats on tomb walls were probably intended to provide the deceased with transportation in the afterlife. Small models of boats were sometimes included in tombs of high-status people for the same reason. Boats may have served to carry the pharaoh's mummy or his funeral party across the Nile from the east bank, where most villages and the palace were found, to the west bank, where most cemeteries were located. The most famous Egyptian boats of all are those excavated at pharaohs' tombs. The boats were buried near the tomb as sacred objects. They may also have been intended as transportation for the pharaoh on a journey in the afterlife to visit the sun god Re, or to accompany him on his daily voyage across the sky in a solar boat. A large boat excavated at Giza, close to the pyramid of King Khufu, was 148 feet long and constructed of Lebanese cedar planks up to 75 feet long and 6 inches thick. It dates to about 2600 BC and is a beautiful example of the skill of Old Kingdom boat builders. A second similar boat has recently been discovered nearby. 4 or 5 smaller boats dating from the Middle Kingdom, about 1859 BC, were found near the pyramid of Senwosret III at Dashur. The ancient Egyptians' long history of nautical traditions fills us with wonder at their technological skill as boat craftsmen and shows us the importance of boats and the Nile.
Mummies represent the hope of ancient Egyptians for an existence beyond their life on Earth. If the physical body could be preserved, then they believed the deceased person's spirit would forever have a resting place. There, the deceased could use the food, offerings, and domestic goods placed in the tomb or represented in reliefs and paintings on the tomb walls. In pre-dynastic Egypt, before about 3100 BC, burials were most often in simple, shallow graves in the desert. There, the hot sand rapidly dried out the body, causing it to survive in a remarkably lifelike state of preservation. But when the Egyptians began to build tombs, corpses were exposed to the air in the burial chamber, so artificial means of preservation were developed to replace the drying sands. Mummification began as simple experiments in treating the body with resins and scented oils before it was wrapped with linen bandages. By Dynasty IV, the Pyramid Age, at around 2600 BC, all the basic processes of mummification were being employed. There were 4 essential stages used regularly over the next 2,500 years, with variations according to the wealth and status of the deceased. The first of these was removal of the internal organs, which were the major source of the bacteria that caused the body to decay. A vertical incision was made in the left side of the abdomen, and the intestines, stomach, liver, and lungs were removed and mummified separately. These were then placed in 4 special containers we call canopic jars. The heart, considered the seat of the emotions and intellect, was left in the body and in later periods protected sometimes by a large amulet in the form of a scarab beetle. In the late pharaonic times, the brain was often extracted from the skull cavity through the nasal passages, but the brain was not considered to be important and received no special treatment. In the second stage of mummification, the body was cleansed and purified. It was dried out rapidly using natron, a natural salt compound containing sodium and calcium carbonates. This process reduced the skin and muscle tissue to a leather-like state which could endure for many thousands of years. The third stage involved packing the body with linen and resinous materials to create a lifelike appearance. Up to the end of the New Kingdom, this was a simple process of filling the abdominal cavity. From about 1000 BC on, well-prepared mummies received quite sophisticated treatment, including insertion of sand and sawdust under the skin, creating a remarkably realistic look. The body was also coated with resins and bitumen. The word mummy comes from the Arabic mumia, which means pitch or bitumen, referring to the blackened appearance of some mummies. The final stage involved wrapping the entire body with long linen bandages. Some mummies were covered with many yards of material. The process began by individually wrapping each finger, toe, and limb. Within the wrappings, sacred amulets of gold, precious stones, and faience were placed in special locations. The most important of these were the scarab beetles for the heart, the wedjet, or sacred eye, for wholeness and general protection, and the djed pillar for stability. The head was covered with a mask that had idealized facial features. In the latest period, after 500 BC, decorative forms of wrapping were developed with geometric patterns in several colors and sometimes a painted image to replace the usual gilt or wooden idealized face. After the mummy was finished, it was placed in a close-fitting and decorated coffin, which usually was mummy-shaped. For people of high status, this coffin was often enclosed in a sarcophagus of wood or stone, which could be carved with religious texts and representation of deities. It was quite common to have 2 coffins, one within the other. As is the case with the material remains of many ancient cultures, there were changes over time in mummification technique and style, as well as in the quality and quantity of grave goods from ancient Egypt. At first, only the bodies of kings and nobility were preserved, but by New Kingdom times, many people were mummified.
During their lifetimes, the ancient Egyptians meticulously prepared for death so that their afterlife would be assured. Because they believed a person's spirit could live forever if the body was protected, they carefully constructed tombs to safeguard the body. The Egyptians left sustenance in the tomb for the deceased's ka, which was that part of a person's spirit that represented his vital force. Food offerings were placed in the tomb for the Ka statue to receive. Prayers were recited at the tomb, and scenes from earthly life were sometimes painted on the walls to recreate the life the deceased hoped to live. After pre-dynastic times, the more elaborate tombs had two basic parts. A sealed burial chamber, which was usually below ground, housed the mummy in a coffin and its personal burial goods. There was also a chapel above ground that was connected to the burial chamber by a false door. The Egyptians believed that the dead person's spirit could leave the mummy and go through the false door to receive the food offerings in the chapel. They also believed the spirit could occupy the Ka statue and relief figures on the chapel walls. It could continue to interact with its living relatives, especially on those days when the family visited the tomb to share a meal with the deceased. Over their long history, the ancient Egyptians built many kinds of tombs. These all originated from simple pre-dynastic burials, where the body was placed in a shallow oval pit without mummification. The pre-dynastic Egyptians usually dug these pits in the western desert, away from the agricultural land. These tombs contained items such as food vessels, jewelry, cosmetic equipment, and weapons. By the early dynastic period, which lasted from about 3100 to 2670 BC, the simple oval grave was expanded to include a building above ground with a flat or curved roof and vertical mud brick walls. This type of tomb superstructure is called a mastaba, an Arabic word that means bench. Below ground, the body was placed in a wooden coffin, and sometimes a separate chamber for grave goods was added. Early in the Old Kingdom, which ran from about 2670 to 2195 BC, Pharaoh Zoser stacked 6 mastabas of decreasing size on top of one another, creating the first step pyramid. This type of tomb soon evolved into the smooth-sided pyramid we're so familiar with. The 4th dynasty kings of the Old Kingdom built the largest of these true pyramids. A king's noblemen were usually buried in mastabas alongside his pyramid complex. By the end of the Old Kingdom, these mastabas sometimes had elaborate above-ground chapels with many rooms that were lavishly decorated. During the Middle Kingdom, which lasted from about 2049 to 1606 BC, the quality of rock-cut tombs and their wall paintings improved. Some early Middle Kingdom kings chose elaborate rock-cut tombs instead of pyramids as their final resting place. Pharaoh Mentuhotep II's rock-cut tomb was surmounted by a terraced temple, probably capped with a cubical structure. Later kings of this period chose pyramids. The New Kingdom lasted from about 1539 to 1070 BC. Its important royal tombs were cut in the rock. You can find the best examples of these royal rock-cut tombs at Thebes. New Kingdom noblemen often had rock-cut tombs that were topped with a small brick pyramid, or that included an inscribed stone slab called a stela, which sometimes had a pyramidal top. Generally, a man would begin to plan his tomb as soon as he succeeded his father as head of the household. Throughout ancient Egypt, whether a tomb was a mastaba, a pyramid, a rock-cut tomb, or, in the case of the general population, simply a burial in the sand, its size and quality were usually determined by the status and wealth of its owner. No matter how great or small, all Egyptian tombs had the same value and meaning. One can still see today inscriptions on Egyptian tombs that reflect this meaning well. As for anyone who might pass in the future, stop and make an offering and prayer that I might be well remembered, and I shall intercede on your behalf in the next world. To understand the Egypt of today, we must look to the long and eventful history of Egypt since ancient times. Pharaonic culture was slowly extinguished by foreign occupations, by the Persians in the 6th century BC, by the Greeks in 332 BC, by the Romans in 30 BC, and by the Arabs in the 7th century AD. The Coptic or Christian community, created through contact with the Eastern Roman Empire, served as a bridge between ancient Egyptian culture and the most important influence on modern Egypt, the Arabs and Islamic culture. The Arabs, with their religion, Islam, brought a rich and sophisticated culture to Egypt. They introduced the Arabic language, which remains Egypt's official language. The Arabs established the city now known as Cairo, near the site of ancient Memphis, at the point of convergence of the Nile Delta. The great mosques of medieval Cairo, many of which are still in use today, were the pride of Islamic empires. When, in 1517, the Ottoman Turks overthrew the Mamluk sultans, Egypt became an overseas province of Imperial Turkey. Egypt subsequently endured 4 centuries of Turkish occupation, a period that shaped the foundations of many aspects of modern Egyptian law and government. A brief French adventure under Napoleon, from 1798 to 1802, was a prelude to later, more aggressive European expansion. The most influential European power in Egypt has been England, which established Egypt as a protectorate in 1882. The English subsequently governed Egypt indirectly until 1952. England developed Egyptian cotton for the British textile industry, while reaping the benefits of its control of the Suez Canal, which was completed in 1869. Today, Egypt is an Arabic socialist republic, created in 1952 when the Free Officers Movement, under Gamal Abdel Nasser, led the Egyptian Revolution and ended English control, and ousted the last of the Turkish rulers. Anwar Sadat, president of Egypt from 1970, moved Egypt toward modernization through trade and social change, and established peace in the region through the Camp David Accords. President Hosni Mubarak continues to move Egypt on a path of development, stability, and peace. Through the efforts of archaeologists and anthropologists, we can see remarkable continuity between ancient and modern adaptations to life in the Nile Valley, especially in aspects such as farming practices and housing styles. Farming methods in the Nile Valley changed very little until the recent construction of dams on the river. You can still see shadoofs for lifting water, wooden plows, and water buffalo turning Persian water wheels, although mechanization is now becoming more common. Although the dams have made possible an astonishing 3 harvests a year in Egypt, the country still struggles to feed its population because of its high birth rate and limited amount of farmland. Some Egyptian peasants migrate to cities and abroad for wage labor. A second major feature shaping Egyptian life today is the religion of Islam. The country's dominantly Muslim population belongs to the large Sunni branch of Islam. The community of believing Muslims, the Ummah, represents Egypt's most powerful force for unity in modern times. Islam has successfully introduced a variety of changes in Egypt. Many urban women, for example, now wear a revived form of Islamic dress instead of the Western style of clothing popular a decade ago. Today in Egypt, the pace of urbanization is phenomenal. Of Egypt's 50 million people, 45% live in cities. The vast majority of people live in densely populated villages, towns, and cities along the Nile and in the Delta. The major cities like Cairo and Alexandria are seriously overpopulated. Most city people maintain their ties with the rural villages of their origin. Family origin can largely determine one's occupation and marriage partner. Traditionally, the marriage of cousins is often strongly preferred as a way to consolidate family wealth. There is a feminist movement in Egypt that dates back to 1919, and today the country has one of the highest rates of female employment in the Middle East. About half the students at Cairo University are female. Women are becoming doctors, lawyers, and engineers, as well as teachers, nurses, domestics, and low-skilled workers. Egypt has many issues to deal with. Its growing Islamic reform movement, its high unemployment, its relations with the rest of the Arab world. Whatever courses it takes, however, Egypt's pride in its past will give it confidence for the future.
The Luxor Temple was begun around 1375 BC by Amenhotep III, one of the most powerful pharaohs of the glorious 18th dynasty. King Ramses II of Dynasty 19 made significant additions to the Amenhotep Temple. It is the work of this monarch that we see when we approach the temple from its primary entrance on the north. Once a year, during a great celebration called the Feast of Opet, the priests of Amun carried the god's golden image from Carnegie to visit Amun of Luxor, who lived in the Luxor Temple. A walk through the Luxor Temple provides a clue as to how the priests of Amun must have felt as they bore the sacred image of their god to the innermost sanctuary of the precinct. In the 19th dynasty, you enter the Luxor Temple through a great gateway, or pylon, built by Ramses II. When it was built, it reached a height of about 75 feet. Originally, the temple door was flanked by two great granite needles called obelisks. Only the one on the left still stands. The one on the right was removed to the Place de Concorde in Paris and re-erected in 1836. We walk between two enormous statues of Ramses II, each 42 feet high, through the massive stone pylon. Ahead of us, just to the left of the entrance, we see an architectural feature added to the Luxor Temple long after the age of the pharaohs. A thick stone wall, penetrated by 3 windows, there on the left, is the lowest story of an Islamic mosque built around 1200 AD to honor a local saint named Abdul Haggag. We now find ourselves in a large courtyard measuring 175 feet by 155 feet. Although some of the material in this court dates to Dynasty 18, most of the architecture was designed and built during the reign of Ramses II of Dynasty 19. Directly ahead of us, 2 giant images of Ramses II flank a doorway. This was the original entrance to the Luxor Temple. It was built during the reign of Amenhotep III. Here we find ourselves at the beginning of a long processional colonnade, passing through a forest of papyrus capitals. Amenhotep III's builders began this part of the temple just before the king's death. It was left unfinished throughout the reign of Amenhotep's son and successor, the heretic pharaoh Akhenaten. When the youthful Tutankhamun came to the throne, he resumed the construction and decoration of the colonnade. In ancient times, a roof covered the colonnade. Although the roof probably had small windows, the walls would have been shrouded in darkness, making it all but impossible for mortals to see the decoration. It is important to remember that the colonnade was once dark and shadowy, because that knowledge helps make the emergence into the next part of the temple, the vast solar court, all the more dramatic. Amenhotep III was justifiably proud of this portion of the Luxor temple. An inscription from his reign states, quote, "He made it as a monument for his father, Amun, king of the gods, erecting for him the temple Anu, of fine white limestone, made very high and wide, adorned with electrum throughout, a place of rest for Amun," unquote. In 1988, Egyptian archaeologists discovered a series of beautiful stone statues buried beneath the floor of the solar court. As we proceed through the solar court, toward the rear of the temple, the ground rises gradually, almost imperceptibly. This increase in elevation represented the primordial mound rising from the waters of chaos, the beginning of Egyptian creation myth. The Holy of Holies, the innermost part of the temple, where the image of the deity was placed, sat on this mound of creation. Climbing 3 steps, we pass a niche flanked by Corinthian columns. This is all that remains of a chapel built for the Romans, who used the Luxor temple in the 3rd century AD. Within the niche is a door. This leads to the innermost part of the temple, the goal of the priests of Amun, who brought their god to the Luxor temple on the Feast of Opet. The first chamber we enter is an offering hall from the reign of Amenhotep III. Here the priests left food and drink for Amun's enjoyment. Next we pass through the bark shrine. This room, as we see it, was built by Alexander the Great, 3 decades before the birth of Christ. The shrine was the final stop for the bark of Amun of Karnak. The priests who carefully carried the golden bark from Karnak placed it upon a great stone altar in the center of this room. Behind the bark shrine, we pass quickly through the private apartments of the south, the apartments that served as the true home of Amun of Luxor. Finally, we enter the Holy of Holies, where the golden statue of Amun of Luxor stood, at the very rear of the temple. Note the remains of the pedestal where Amun's image once rested. A trip through the Luxor temple takes us through 4,000 years of history, from the reigns of 2 of Egypt's most powerful pharaohs, Amenhotep III and Ramses II, through the era of the Roman domination and the emergence of Islam, to today, when archaeologists continue to help us understand this remarkable building.